So this is the block that we'll be working on, and as you can see I've designed 3 tulip shapes with a central little circle in the middle, and they're set on point. So to start with, what you're going to need is the template, which you have as a downloadable document, and you can see we've got template A, which is the tulip, and template B, which is the circle. And they're drawn so that these horizontal and vertical lines in the middle represent the vertical and horizontal axis as the centre, so that you can place template B over the centre, and then a diagonal line allows you to line up the tulip so that it is centrally lined up. Then position your tulip before you press it down. So what are we going to need for our block? Well, I've got a 2-inch strip of my centre circle block. You can get away with a 2-inch square, will be more than enough, but I want to fussy cut my centre with this floral in the middle so that it makes it a bit more interesting on the centre of the block. So I cut myself a 2-inch strip rather than a 2-inch square. I've got a 5-inch by 18 to 20-inch strip of my main fabric for the tulips, and I've also got a thread. So this is an Aurifil 50 weight thread that picks out the dark red on this floral fabric. So whether you want to go high contrast or whether you want to go with either something that is a lot more closer to maybe the pink, or you could even pick out the green, or whatever suits your fabrics, that's really up to you. But I decided that I wanted to go with high contrast. In addition to that, I've got a 13-inch square of background fabrics. I've got my template already printed out, and I'm using light steam seam 2. You can use Bondaweb or whatever other fusible interfacing, double-sided fusible interfacing that you prefer to use, but make sure you follow the instructions for what you are actually using. So before we start and do anything, I want to look at my sewing machine and look at the setup for it. This is my Bernina. It's a Aurora 440. It's at least 15 years old now, and it's computerized, so I have buttons that I need to press. So for me, I've got preset buttons here, and this is number 2 is for my zigzag. It is here, so if I press that, my screen presets to the stitch length being 1.5 and the stitch width being 3.3. In order to change that, I would recommend that you have a play with your machine and decide what length or width that you like. So on my machine, I can take the width up and down with these arrows. So if I take it down to 2.9 maybe, and if I take my length down, and actually I'm going to take mine down, in fact I'll stop, take it right down, so how wide the stitch is stitched. Oh, that's the wrong way. So oops, I'm going to take it down to 0.3. I'm using a 50 weight thread, and I've stitched out some samples for that. But we'll just look at an older machine and see how we can change it on that as well. So this is my Elna ZZ Lotus, and it's really old. This is a good 45 years old. And you can see on here, I literally can only move the dials. I can move it to number 3, say that is what I'm doing, is a zigzag stitch, and then the length of the stitch I have to lower, and I want it, don't want it as 0, but I want it between maybe half and 0, so I can do a very fine zigzag stitch, and we'll have a look at that in a moment, and have a look also at the feet that we're going to use. So I have my feet here, and I've got 2 different feet. I have got this one, which is a number 20 foot from my Bernina, and most feet on Bernina machines are the same numbers. They just fit most machines, but do check your machine to make sure that you have the right foot. This is open-toed, so I can see exactly what's going on. I also have the foot from the Elna, and it's a plastic foot, and you can see again it has got an open toe, but being clear and plastic you can see exactly where you're going on. So you're looking for a foot that has a wide opening for the needle to go backwards and forwards in, and it's either open toed or it's plastic so you can see through it. I'm also going to be using a Schmetz embroidery needle, and these are size 75/11 that I've actually got here, but an 80/12 is perfectly good enough. But an embroidery needle is much sharper and will pierce through all the layers, particularly of the Bondaweb or the steam seam or whatever it is that you're using. So I've got here some samples that I just fused the little pieces of fabric that were left over onto just a piece of scrap background fabric, and then I played with my machine, and I've written, only in pencil, but I've written on here, you know, what thread I've used, the widths. So this particular orange one, I've used 28 weight thread, and I've used the width of the stitch, so how close these stitches go together at 0.3. That was my favourite, but I didn't actually have thread that was 28 weight and the right colour. So this variegated thread here, again, it's stitched at 0.3 and also being variegated. It was a 50 weight thread. I quite liked that. I tried a few others and played with the width of the stitches, so I went down to 2.5 width here, which is very, very narrow. 2.2 was even more narrow. And in the end, I particularly like 2.7 or 2.9. So, and I played with different types of thread. I played with thread that was more of a matching colour. And if you look at the tulip, you can see here how having a matching colour makes a difference on how the overall tulip will look. I liked the fact that I used a really high contrast thread, so that as I was going around it, it really stands out. So we're going to have a play with a little piece of scrap fabrics, and just so that we can look at the settings on our sewing machine and have a play. And I would highly recommend you do that before you start anything. So we'll just have a look on the sewing machine to see exactly what I'm talking about in terms of the width of the stitch and the length of the stitch. So I'm sat here at the sewing machine, and I've got my machine set at the original settings of 1.5 in stitch length and a 3.3 wide in the stitch width of how wide it stitches. So if I lower my needle is lowering on the left, which is on the inside of the fabric. I'll just hold on to these two threads, which is the top and the bobbin, so that they don't get pulled down. If you have got a start-stop function and a knotting function, you can use that. And you can see my machine is going either side. And what I want is for the needle to finish on the outside of the edge of the fabric here. So as it comes down to the right, it needs to actually go down and sit just to the right of where the fabric ends. So I know that my stitch length is too long. If I just do a few more stitches and turn that round, you can see that that is, in terms of a satin stitch, it's a beautiful zigzag, but it's not a satin stitch. In order to get a satin stitch, we need to make sure that the length of our stitch is much shorter. So I'm going to take the length of my stitch down to 0.6, okay, and then we'll see exactly what that does. Again, I'm trying to keep the needle to the right of my fabric. As it comes down on the right, it needs to sit just to the right of the edge of the fabric. Let's have a look at what that looks like. So it's close, but I don't think that is close enough for a satin stitch, so I will just take it down a little bit more, and I'm going to take it down to 0.3. Just going to work my way. Obviously, fabric goes through much slower because the stitches are much smaller. I'm just going to get to the edge and rotate this and go down a bit, not quite at the edge though. And if we rotate that and have a look, it's a much tighter stitch. They're much closer together. I could take it down one more time and make it at 0.2, and we'll see what a difference that makes. I'm just allowing the sewing machine to pull the fabric through and just making sure again that the needle is coming on the right of the outside of the fabric. Rotate that, and you can see that's much closer, a much tighter stitch than the 0.3 and 0.4s. So depending on the look that you're looking for, a satin stitch is a very close stitch that looks like they are right next to each other. So 0.2 or 0.3, depending on the thread that you're using and the weight of that thread. So if I was using maybe a 40 weight thread, then I would probably go for 0.3, but actually this time round I'm going to go for 0.2. It's a much slower process in terms of stitching out, but it is a much neater and much finer stitch that's much closer together. So that's how we look at the stitch length. So what about the stitch width? So if I just move the needle up and move over to the other side, it really doesn't matter that I haven't stopped my threads. So in terms of the width, I can go much wider. So that's about 4.5. That's 4.5 millimeters wide. And have a look at that. You can see that that is considerably wider than what we had before in terms of over here. This at 3.3 I still think is probably just a bit too wide for what we're going to do. So I found that the width I liked was about 2.9. So if I repeat what I was doing, again, I've stopped with my needle in the down position on the outside of the fabric here. So if we see how we get on doing this at the width of the stitch, how wide it is stitching those stitches, then I'm at 2.9. Let's see. And we can see, straight away just how different these are. So the width of these at 4.5 to these at 2.9. So whether you go for 2.9 or 3, this is just a setting I like on my machine. So what I want you to do is have a play first, just with some scraps, and see on your sewing machine which satin stitch settings you like. Take a note of those settings so that you can always go back, and if you stop in the middle of something and you've got to put your machine away for any reason, you know exactly what the settings were. If you've got a memory facility on your machine, then you might want to use that and save your settings as well. So once you're happy with your machine settings, we'll move on to our background square. So I've slightly starched my background square to start with. I'm going to fold it in half, and I'm just going to finger press that fold. I'm going to fold it in half again because I've got that starch in there. I'm just going to finger press it, and then I'm going to fold it along the diagonals, and with this will give us the lines that we need when we come to press. I'm just going to turn that over so that I can give it an extra press on this side. So when I open it up, all of my markings, both horizontally and vertically and diagonally, are showing on the fabric. And the next stage will be to trace off our pattern pieces onto our Bonder web or steamer seam, whatever fusible interfacing that you're using, and we'll do that next. So I've got here my template, and I've got some fusible, double-sided fusible interfacing, whichever one that you're using. Now, as I say, I'm using the light steam seam 2, and I know that I need to draw on the side that has the yellow squares so that I can peel the paper on the back and stick the drawn shapes onto my fabric. So if you lay your steamer seam over your template, I don't know whether you can see that, but you can see through, I can see through. If you're having trouble seeing, then you can lay your template over on a light box if you have one, or just tape it to a window with lots of light coming through it, and you'll be able to see through, and you're going to trace your designs onto your fusible interfacing so that you've got all the shapes drawn out. I'm then going to take my fabric and fuse these onto my fabric. So without cutting out the shapes, I will probably just cut through here and cut the circle off, so that I can then reposition this one onto the remaining part of the fabric, and we'll go away and do that. And then you're going to use your iron to press it onto the fabric, and then cut out your shapes. So we'll come back once I've done that. So I've got here my cutout pieces. So I've got my 4 tulip shapes, and I've just got my centre dot to cut out. So when you're cutting out, I like to use big scissors as opposed to small ones, because what you can do is use the whole blade, and then you can turn, rather than turning your hand with the scissors, you can turn the piece of fabric or paper or whatever it is you're cutting, and you just adjust the blade so you get a nice smooth cut. Whether you cut on the line, around, outside it, or just inside it, it's really up to you, because we're not going to see that. And just turn it and turn it and turn it until you come and you've cut the whole thing out. So now we can use our template to position our fabrics. So I've got the lines on my fabric so that, sorry, my ring is catching on my sewing machine here. I can see the lines, the horizontal and vertical lines, and I can line up my fabric on the template, and I can take my first paper piece, and the easiest way to get your papers off of the back is to score it with a pin or a needle, and you'll find that that will easily take your papers off. And because I can see the template underneath the fabric, I can position my first petal. This is sticky so that you can reposition it, so that I can get that point right on the diagonal line there. Place it down, and then I can rotate the fabric and repeat as I go round the block. And I leave my centre dot till the end, so that I've always got the lines. If you're not sure and you can't see, then you can line up your pressed lines with the print so that you can see what you're doing. And you just continue to go round, scoring and positioning your pieces. Just moved that slightly. And positioning your pieces so that they fall in the right place. And you continue to do that with all 4 pieces and position it. And then the last thing that you're going to do is position your centre piece in the centre there. You're going to take it to the pressing mat and press these in place. So we're back at the sewing machine, and what I'm going to do is line up. Let's just get a closer look at what we're doing here. Line up the edge. Here we go. So I'm lining up the edge of my fabric inside. Put my presser foot down. And what I want is I want my needle, I'm just using my flywheel to go down. I want my needle to hit on the outside. So as it goes down on the outside, I want it to hit just outside that fabric. I'm just going to manoeuvre this so I can line it up as I'm sewing. I use my scissors here. So you can see here the edge of the fabric. So as the needle zigzags left to right, I always want the right hand, as the needle comes down on the right hand side, to always stop just on the outside edge of the fused fabrics that we've got here, and then the full left extension of the width of your stitches goes on the inside of the fabric. I'm going to use a locking stitch just to hold my stitches in place, and we'll get going. So I'm starting on a fairly straight edge so that I'm not hitting any curves immediately, so I can just get everything set up. So there's my locking stitch, and I just want to keep going and keep adjusting my fabric as I go, so that the needle is always landing just on the outside edge. So it's still quite a straight area. And as you come to a gentle curve, you can adjust your fabrics as you go round. But we're getting into a bit of a deeper curve here, so I'm going to stop with my needle down on the outside here. And what I want to do is when the curve is on the outside edge here, so it's a convex curve, so it's an outside sticking curve, you want your needle to be on the inside and keep it on the inside with your needle down, and then slightly lift your presser foot, or if you've got a hover action, just hover that foot so you can just swivel slightly and turn. Take a few more stitches, stop on the inside of the fabric and turn again. A few more stitches, stop again on the inside. If you have a knee lift on your machine and you can use that, it works very well. Just keep going round and stop again. And you continue round your curve. As you're going, always on this outside curve, always stopping your needle on the inside of the fabric. And it is a very, very small adjustment that you're doing as you're going round this curve. And again, just going on the outside there. Stop on the inside and do the adjustment. As you can see, I'm just turning it very, very gently as I get to this almost straight bit at the base of the petals in the flower. But I'm coming to another curve. So I'm going to stop there and rotate. And rotate again. And rotate again. Doesn't want to move, but we'll just make it happen. Again, I'm getting to a very gentle curve here, so I can rotate the fabric under the foot to manipulate it and into a straight arc of the edge of the flower. And we just stop it there and rotate the sewing. Just come out so you can see. So we've got a really nice smooth curve coming around on the outside of this petal. So if we go back, and we're getting to a curve that is on the inside, so it's a concave curve. So the curving of the fabric is happening on the inside rather than the outside. And then if I get myself a bit closer to this curve, so this time round I'm going to stop my needle on the outside of the fabric because the curve is on the inside. So whichever way your curve goes, if it's an outside curve, you stop on the inside, and if it's an inside curve, you stop on the outside of the fabric. So I'm just going to stop there. Small adjustment. And adjust again. And when they're tight curves, this is more important that you take just a few stitches and keep adjusting. Just adjust again. But we're also coming into a point here. So I want to get around this curve. You can see I'm literally taking a stitch at a time at this point, and then stopping on the outside, and always stopping on the outside. I'm just going to adjust my stitch width just slightly. I'm just going to take the width down literally 1 notch as you go. Now I've gone from 2.9 to 2.5 on my machine, but always make sure when you're doing that that you are stopping with the needle on the outside of your fabric, so any adjustments will show on the inside rather than the outside. So I'm going to work myself a bit closer, adjust my needle. I'm going to take my stitch length down, do a couple more. I'm going to take my stitch length down, or the width of my stitch rather. I've gone down to 2.2 now. And then when I get really close, so I'm about 1/8 of an inch away from that point, I'm going to take the stitch width down to about 1.6. And it's a very tiny stitch, and I want to go in my stitches to go right to the edge and stop on the outside point here. So I've stopped with my needle in the right hand side position, and I'm going to lift my presser foot and rotate, and I am literally going to do a stitch forward, and just now my needle is in the right hand side position again. I'm going to rotate again and come out. I'm now on an outside curve, so any changes to the width, to the width, the needle needs to be on the outside, but as I change with the curve, when I'm curving the stitching, I need to stop with the needle on the inside to adjust my fabric as I go. I've still got quite a straight bit here, so stopping with my needle down and now increasing my stitch length back up to 2. Just going to lift that slightly. I'm going to increase my stitch length to 2.4. And increase it again slightly. And back up to where I was at 2.9. So I will carry on round this outside curve, stopping on the inside of the fabric. Again, adjusting on the inside of the fabric. Trying to keep my needle at all times as it comes down on the right hand side, just to the right of the fabric. Just that curve again. Adjust it again. And this is as you keep going round, this is all you're doing is adjusting the position of your fabric and the position of your needle. And rotating your fabric as you go. It's quite a gentle curve. So we're coming into a point. So we're coming into the point here where there's a bit of a V. I'm just going to reduce my stitches down as I get slightly closer, again within 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to reduce my stitches to about 2.4, but I will do it on a gradual rotation as I go round here. So just going to reduce my stitch length down to 2.5 there as the width of my stitch, rather. Come into that point till my needle gets right into the point. So the needle on the right hand is on the right hand side of the zigzag as it's come down. It's right on the point of that feature within the petal that we've got on here, or the tulip. I'm going to rotate my fabric quite a lot till it is at a 45 degree or a straight line coming through that angle. So if it was here, it would be like a 45 degree angle coming out, that it's even between the two edges of these two bits. I'm going to do literally one stitch. Oh, I've done too many. So I'm literally trying to go back into that same stitch of the V. I'm going to rotate again. I'll do this by hand. Rotate my fabrics again. And then come out. And increase my stitch length back up to where I was. So go round again. This is an outside curve. It's a gentle curve, so I'm just easing the fabric as I go into this straight edge here. Again, I am just going to reduce my stitch down. I've gone down from 2.9 to 2.5. It's almost like a 90 degree here. I want to go as far up to that point as I can, and I'm right on the point of the edge of the tulip point. I'm just going to rotate slightly so I can come out. Just stop and rotate. Increase my stitch length back up to 2.9, which is where I was. again I'm coming down to a point here. So my needle is on the outside of the zigzag, and it's landed to the right hand side on the edge of the fabric. So I'm going to reduce my stitch length again, coming back down into this point. That's an inside point. Stop with my needle down on the outside, rotate it, and do a stitch and rotate it, and do a stitch and rotate it again. So you're using that central point of the V as it comes in to actually use it as a pivot point. I'm just coming out so I can increase my stitches back up and go round this outside curve. So I'm getting to a tighter part of the curve now. Stop on the inside of the fabric, on the inside of that curve. And again, stop and rotate. I'm going to take my stitch length right down, start to go down to 2.4. Till I get closer to that point. Make sure I'm coming on that on a straight line, and reduce it down again to 2. So I'm about 1/8 of an inch away, so I'll reduce it down again. Just make sure that's come in. And stop right on the point of that outside point. Just going to do a couple of stitches so I can rotate again and come up the inside of that point. Increase my stitches. And I'm now on an inside curve, a concave curve, so when I do those movements to rotate the fabric, I'm stopping on the outside of the fabric because it's an inside curve. And I'm going to increase my stitch length again. A few more stitches and rotate and increase to my usual length. Stop and rotate my fabric. This is a bit of a tight curve here. So lots of short stops, 2 or 3 stitches, needle down and rotate. Needle down and rotate. Needle down and rotate. And we're coming back up to join up with where we started. I've got hold of this thread so it doesn't get caught up. Just going to come up and go over a couple of those stitches and do my locking stitch again. Oops. And that is it. Just pull this out. Not the neatest for me, but that's okay. It's a blind man on a galloping horse will be very pleased to see that. I'm really pleased with these curves here and these curves, and actually I'm really pleased with how these inside points look as well, and this outside point up here is very neat and tidy. So that is how you would do the inside curves, the outside curves, whether you're coming to a point, an outside point, or an inside point like a V. That's how you would maneuver it, and you will repeat that with all of your stitches, with all of your petals. I will just show you what I do with the back. So with the back, this has been caught up, so that's not going to do anything at all. Just going to snip that one in. It's caught in these stitches, and see if we can pull. Yep, I've got a thread coming up there. So I can literally just tie this in a simple knot, and I can get my fingers through it. No, that's not going to work. Finally, so 2 or 3 knots on top of each other just to stop them coming undone. And then I can snip those knots through, just slightly away from the knots. And this thread that was my starting thread here, because the other thread underneath has been pulled back and through, I'm just going to snip that off where it is. So when we come to do our curve on our circle, again we want to start with the needle ideally on the outside, so I'm just going to take a stitch. There we go, it's just popped over to the right hand side. Going to bring my needle down, but because this is quite a small circle, what I need to do is make sure it's an outside curve that we're sewing on. So I always want to do the lifting my foot rather, with the needle down on the inside, and I need to be doing that regularly so that it is a very smooth curve around here and not staccatoed at all. Just going to press my locking stitch. So with a circle and with a tight curve like this, it is literally lots of stopping and starting to work your way around. So it's always a gentle gap on the outside as you work around the circle. just those little adjustments as you go round. And depending on how wide your stitch is will depend on how many times you have to do that. I've gone for quite a small width on my stitch width. So you can see it's just a very small adjustment on moving that fabric as you go, because you always want to keep the needle touching the outside of the fabric and not too far away from it. Some people like to use a product called Stitch and Tear, so it stabilises the whole of your fabric, or you can use, which is like a sticky Vilene that sticks onto the back, and then you tear it away once all your stitches are done. It just holds everything very flat. You could use freezer paper to do that as well, or like me, I'm quite happy. I've given my fabric a bit of a heavy starch just so it's got some stiffness about it. It's your choice however you want to do that. The whole point is to work out what works best for you, and how much you're going to do of satin stitch applique. Take this thread to one side, keep it out of the way. And again, I'm just going to work towards where I started. There we go, just a couple of stitches over. I'm going to use my locking stitch again. It's going to stitch in place, and that is me done. Set my stitches, turn it over, and you can see that's off from the back side. That is really smooth and neat. So I'm just going to see if I can pull any of those threads through, which it would appear my locking stitch has worked, so I'm just going to snip those off, turn it back over, and snip my threads close to. So there you have it. I've gone around my circle and it's come out very neat and tidy. Very pleased with that, and you would continue to do each of your petals the same as we've done here. So adjusting your stitch width and length, or the width of your stitch rather, how wide it is as you come round into points that you need to do, or into a corner where it just needs to be reduced slightly. and you would continue to do the other three petals, and then once you've done that, you can trim your block down. So you can trim the whole block down to 12.5 inches using the centre of your circle as where you measure from. So you'd measure from the centre. If you place a square ruler onto the, I don't have one to hand, quite to hand, let's, here we go. So I've got a Creative Grids ruler here, and we'll just move this in. So if I lay 6.25 inch mark, which actually, this is my 6, on this ruler it's actually a white line, and there's a 6.25 here, and I've got a very, very small, don't know whether you can see that. There's a circle, a white circle around here, which is the 6.25 inch mark right here. And if I position that to the centre, so the white lines are coming out pretty much centre of this, then I can trim around the block to make sure that it is, this is a 12.5 inch ruler, so I can measure 6.25 inches if you've got a smaller ruler, 6.25 inches out from the centre either side, and then rotate the block, position your ruler again if it's smaller, and again measure 6.25 from the centre to do the other two sides for trimming your block. So there you have it, crafty monkeys. That's how you do satin stitch.